Susan Perry woke up at 5:30 in the morning, just as she had done for the past 15 years. The small bedroom in her cottage was still dark, but the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the sky outside her window with soft shades of pink and orange. She lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of Maple Bay waking up, the distant call of seagulls, the gentle rustle of wind through the maple trees that gave the town its name, and somewhere down the street, the faint bark of the Johnsons' old retriever. She pushed herself out of bed with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago accepted her routine. Her joints protested slightly. 65 years will do that to a person. But Susan had learned to ignore the small complaints of age. She had bigger things to carry than a few aches and pains. The cottage was small but comfortable. Susan had bought it with her savings 15 years ago when she first arrived in Maple Bay. Back then, she had been looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from the life she had left behind. The little coastal town, population 3,000, had been perfect. Small enough that everyone knew everyone, but not so small that a newcomer stood out too much. She had settled in, found her job driving the school bus, and slowly, year by year, the weight of her past had become a little easier to bear. Susan made her way to the small kitchen and started the coffee maker. While it gurgled and hissed, she went through her morning stretches, another routine she had developed over the years. Touch the toes, stretch the back, roll the shoulders. Her body might be getting older, but she tried to keep it working as well as she could. With a steaming mug of coffee in hand, she sat at the small kitchen table and looked out the window at her tiny garden. The tomato plants were doing well this year. She had planted them in the spring, and now, in late September, they were heavy with red fruit. Gardening had become one of her simple pleasures. There was something calming about working with the earth, about nurturing something and watching it grow. But even as she sipped her coffee and watched the sunrise, Susan's mind drifted to places she tried not to go. 15 years was a long time, but some memories never truly faded. She could still remember that day as if it were yesterday. She had been working at the Chicago Police Department for 25 years by then. Not as an officer on the street, but as a system analyst in the Digital Forensics Division. It was technical work, the kind that most people didn't even know existed. She managed databases, maintained security systems, and made sure that all the digital evidence and records were properly organized and accessible. Susan had been good at her job, very good. She had received awards, commendations, and the respect of her colleagues. She had helped solve countless cases by finding the right piece of information at the right time, by making sure the systems worked flawlessly, by creating programs that helped detectives connect dots that would have otherwise remained scattered. But then came that one mistake. It was a small error, really, a tiny piece of code in a database update. She had been working on upgrading the criminal record system, implementing a new search function that would make it easier to cross-reference different types of offenses. In the thousands of lines of code, in the hundreds of hours of work, she had made one small mistake. A single character in the wrong place. It had caused a glitch in how the system flagged active warrants. The glitch had only lasted for 3 days before she caught it and fixed it. But in those 3 days, Michael Henderson, a man with multiple outstanding warrants for armed robbery, had been pulled over for a traffic violation. When the officer ran his license, the system should have shown the warrants, should have told the officer that this was a dangerous criminal who needed to be arrested immediately. But because of Susan's error, the warrants didn't show up. The officer gave Henderson a ticket for the broken tail light and let him go. 2 weeks later, Henderson robbed another store. This time, the security guard had confronted him. There had been a struggle. The guard had been badly hurt, spent months in the hospital, and never fully recovered. Susan had been devastated. The department had conducted an investigation, of course. They had found that it was an honest mistake, that Susan had caught and fixed the error as soon as she discovered it, that there was no malice or negligence involved. They didn't fire her. They told her these things happen, that systems are complex, that no one is perfect. But Susan couldn't forgive herself. She saw the security guard's face every time she closed her eyes. She knew it wasn't entirely her fault. Henderson was the one who chose to commit the crime. But she also knew that her mistake had given him the opportunity. If she had caught the error sooner, if she had been more careful, if she had double-checked that one line of code, the weight of it had crushed her. She had fallen into a deep depression. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on her work. After 6 months of therapy and medication, she had made a decision. She couldn't do that work anymore. The responsibility was too much. The potential for her mistakes to hurt people was too great. So she had resigned. She had sold her apartment in Chicago, packed her belongings into her car, and driven until she found a place that felt far enough away. That place had been Maple Bay. The sound of her phone alarm brought Susan back to the present. 6:30. Time to get ready for her route. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and went to take a quick shower. By 7 o'clock, she was dressed in her usual work clothes, comfortable jeans, a plain blue t-shirt, and her worn sneakers. She grabbed her lunch bag from the fridge, picked up her keys, and headed out to her car for the short drive to the bus depot. The streets of Maple Bay were quiet at this hour. The town was just beginning to stir. A few early risers were out walking their dogs, and the bakery on Main Street was opening up, the smell of fresh bread wafting into the morning air. Susan waved to Martha, who owned the flower shop, and Martha waved back with a warm smile. This was what Susan loved about Maple Bay: the simplicity, the kindness, the sense that everyone was part of a community. No one here knew about her past. To them, she was just Miss Perry, the reliable bus driver who never missed a day of work and always had a kind word for everyone. At the depot, her bus was waiting. Number 7. She had been driving this same bus for 15 years. She knew every sound it made, every quirk of its steering, every rattle and hum. She did her daily inspection, checking the tires, the lights, the emergency exits, and then climbed into the driver's seat. The seat was worn in all the right places, molded to her body from years of use. Susan started the engine and listened to its familiar rumble. Everything sounded good. She checked her route list, even though she had memorized it years ago. First stop, Elm Street, then Oak Avenue, then the cluster of houses by the marina, and so on, until she had picked up all 43 students and delivered them safely to Maple Bay Elementary and Maple Bay Middle School. She pulled out of the depot at 7:30, right on schedule. The bus was large and yellow and announced itself with a gentle squeak of brakes at every stop. Susan didn't mind the early hours or the repetitive nature of the work. In fact, she found comfort in it. Every day was predictable. Every day was safe. Every day, she got to see the smiling faces of children who trusted her to get them to school safely. Her first stop was at the corner of Elm Street and 3rd Avenue. Little Emma Watson was always the first student on the bus. She was 7 years old, with bright red hair and freckles across her nose. She was also always early, standing at the corner with her backpack that was almost as big as she was. "Good morning, Miss Perry," Emma chirped as she climbed aboard. "Good morning, Emma," Susan replied with a warm smile. "How are you today?" "I'm good. We're going to learn about butterflies in science class today. Did you know that monarch butterflies migrate thousands of miles?" "I did know that," Susan said. "It's quite amazing, isn't it? Such small creatures traveling so far." Emma nodded enthusiastically and made her way to her favorite seat, the third row on the right. Susan waited until Emma was seated and then closed the door and continued on her route. Stop after stop, the bus filled with children. Some were chatty, like Emma, sharing stories about their pets or their weekend plans or what they had for breakfast. Others were quiet, still half asleep, staring out the windows with bleary eyes. Susan greeted each one by name. She knew all of them. She had been driving some of these kids since they were in kindergarten, and now they were in middle school. The Peterson twins, Jake and Luke, got on at Oak Avenue. They were 12 and identical, and they took great pleasure in trying to confuse people about which was which. But Susan could tell them apart. Jake had a small scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident 2 years ago. "Morning, Jake. Morning, Luke," she said as they boarded. "How do you always know?" Luke asked, grinning. "A good driver pays attention to details," Susan replied with a wink. The Ramirez children got on at the marina stop. Carlos, Sophia, and little Miguel. Their mother, Rosa, always stood at the bus stop with them, even though Miguel was already 9 years old. Rosa would wave to Susan, and Susan would wave back. They had developed a friendship over the years. Rosa sometimes brought tamales to the Christmas potluck at the school, and they were always the first dish to disappear. By 8:15, all 43 students were on the bus, and Susan was pulling up to Maple Bay Elementary. The younger children filed off first, their backpacks bouncing as they hurried toward the school entrance. Then Susan continued to the middle school, just 2 blocks away, where the older students disembarked. "Have a good day, everyone," Susan called out as the last student, a shy girl named Rachel, stepped off the bus. "You too, Miss Perry," several voices called back. With the morning route complete, Susan drove back to the depot. She had 3 hours before the afternoon route, when she would do the whole thing in reverse, picking up the kids from school and taking them home. She used the time to clean the bus, do some paperwork, and eat her lunch in the small break room at the depot. Her colleague, Tom Harrison, was already there, eating a sandwich. Tom drove the high school route. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and a belly that hung over his belt. He had been driving buses for 30 years and knew everything there was to know about the job. "Morning, Susan," Tom said around a mouthful of sandwich. "How was the route?" "Smooth as always," Susan replied, pulling out her own lunch, a salad she had prepared the night before. "The Peterson twins tried to trick me again." Tom laughed. "Those boys, they tried the same thing with me last year when I was covering your route. Didn't work then either. Kids don't realize we actually pay attention." They chatted for a while about various topics: the upcoming town harvest festival, the weather forecast, the new restaurant that was opening on Main Street. It was easy conversation, the kind that required no deep thought or emotional investment. Susan appreciated that. After lunch, she spent some time reading a novel she had borrowed from the library. It was a mystery set in the Scottish Highlands. She liked mysteries, though she avoided anything too dark or violent. She had seen enough of the real-world consequences of violence in her old job. She didn't need to read about it for entertainment. At 2:30, she was back in her bus, heading to the schools for the afternoon pickup. The routine was the same, just in reverse. Pick up the kids, drop them off at their stops, wave to the parents, and make sure everyone got home safely. It was almost 4 o'clock by the time she finished her route and returned to the depot. She was tired but satisfied. Another day done. Another day where all her students had arrived safely at their destinations. It might not seem like much to some people, but to Susan, it meant everything. These small successes, these simple responsibilities, they helped balance out the weight of her past mistakes. She drove home, parked her car in the small driveway beside her cottage, and went inside. The house was quiet and cool. She kicked off her shoes, poured herself a glass of water, and sat down on the couch with a satisfied sigh. This was her life now. Simple, quiet, safe. And most days, that was enough. The next few weeks passed in their usual comfortable rhythm. Susan drove her routes, tended her garden, and participated in the gentle social life of Maple Bay. On Thursday evenings, she volunteered at the town library, helping people find books and occasionally teaching a basic computer skills class for seniors who wanted to learn how to use email or browse the internet. The library was one of Susan's favorite places in Maple Bay. It was small, housed in a beautiful old building that had once been a church. The high ceilings and large windows gave it an airy, peaceful feeling. The head librarian, Margaret Chen, had become one of Susan's closest friends in town. Margaret was in her early 60s, with short silver hair and glasses that always seemed to be sliding down her nose. She had moved to Maple Bay about 10 years ago after retiring from a career as a professor of English literature in Seattle. Like Susan, she had been looking for a quieter life. "I swear, these computers get more complicated every year," Margaret said one Thursday evening, looking at the library's checkout system with frustration. "It's updating again, and I can't figure out the new interface." Susan came around the desk to look at the screen. Within minutes, she had navigated the update, adjusted the settings, and shown Margaret the new features. "How do you always figure these things out so quickly?" Margaret asked, amazed. Susan shrugged. "I'm just good with computers, I guess. I've always found them easier to understand than people." It was true. Technology had always made sense to Susan in a way that human behavior sometimes didn't. Computers followed rules. They did what they were programmed to do. They were predictable and logical. People, on the other hand, were messy and emotional, and often made decisions that seemed to defy all logic. Of course, Susan also knew that her comfort with technology came from years of professional experience. But that wasn't something she talked about. When people in Maple Bay asked about her past, she kept it vague. She said she had worked in office administration in Chicago, which was true in a broad sense. She said she had gotten tired of the big city and wanted a change of pace, which was also true, if not the whole truth. Most people in Maple Bay didn't pry. Small towns respected certain boundaries. Everyone had their own reasons for being where they were, and as long as you were a good neighbor and a contributing member of the community, people didn't ask too many questions. On Friday nights, Susan sometimes went to the community center for the weekly potluck dinner. These were informal gatherings where people brought food to share and spent a few hours catching up with neighbors. Susan usually brought a simple dish, a pasta salad or a plate of cookies, and spent the evening chatting with various townsfolk. At one such dinner in early October, she found herself sitting with a group that included Rosa Ramirez, Tom Harrison, and a man named Bill Crawford, who owned the hardware store on Main Street. "So, Susan, are you going to enter the baking contest at the Harvest Festival this year?" Rosa asked. The Maple Bay Harvest Festival was the town's biggest event, held every October to celebrate the fall season. "Oh, I don't know," Susan said modestly. I'm not much of a baker. But your chocolate chip cookies are always gone first at these potlucks, Rosa protested. You should definitely enter. Maybe I will, Susan said, smiling. The truth was, she enjoyed baking. It was another one of those simple, methodical activities that helped quiet her mind. Following a recipe, measuring ingredients, creating something warm and comforting. It was therapeutic in its own way. I'm entering my peach pie, Tom announced. Been making the same recipe for 20 years. I figure one of these years I'll finally win. You should have won last year, Bill said loyally. Tom and Bill had been friends for decades. Martha Sullivan's lemon meringue only won because she's on the organizing committee. Now, Susan said diplomatically. Martha's lemon meringue is excellent. But so is your peach pie, Tom. The conversation drifted to other topics. The upcoming autumn weather, the high school football team's winning streak, the new doctor who had just opened a practice in town. Susan listened more than she talked, which was her usual style. She found that people appreciated a good listener, and she genuinely enjoyed hearing about the simple dramas and joys of small-town life. After dinner, as people were cleaning up, Margaret pulled Susan aside. "Can I ask you a favor?" Margaret said. "The library's internet has been acting up. Sometimes it just drops out for no reason. I called the service provider, but they can't send anyone for 2 weeks. I don't suppose you might be able to take a look at it?" "Of course," Susan said. "I can stop by tomorrow morning if you'd like." "That would be wonderful. Thank you so much." The next morning, Susan drove to the library. It was a Saturday, so it was closed to the public, but Margaret had given her a key years ago for occasions like this. Inside, Susan went to the small office where the internet modem and router were kept. It didn't take her long to diagnose the problem. The router was old and overheating. It needed better ventilation and probably needed to be replaced soon. Susan repositioned it, cleared away some papers that had been blocking its vents, and adjusted some settings to optimize its performance. She also wrote down the model number and did a quick search on her phone. The router was 7 years old, which was ancient in technology terms. She texted Margaret. "Fixed the immediate problem, but the router is old and will need replacing soon. I can help you order a new one if you want." Margaret texted back. "You're a lifesaver. Yes, please, on the new router. What would we do without you?" Susan smiled at the message. It felt good to be useful, to help people with simple problems that she could easily solve. These small acts of service were part of what made her feel like she was contributing something positive to the world. The rest of October passed pleasantly. Susan prepared her chocolate chip cookies for the baking contest. She didn't win, but she got an honorable mention, which pleased her. She helped decorate the community center for the Harvest Festival. She continued her daily bus routes, watching the maple trees around town gradually transform into brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. On Halloween, she handed out candy to the trick-or-treaters who came to her door. She recognized most of them. Many were students from her bus route. Emma Watson dressed as a butterfly, which made Susan smile, remembering their conversation about monarch butterflies from months ago. By early November, the weather was turning cold. The first frost came, and Susan had to start wearing a heavier jacket for her morning routes. She said goodbye to her tomato plants, which had finally succumbed to the cold, and started planning what she would plant in the spring. Life was good. Simple, quiet, and good. Susan had found a kind of peace in Maple Bay. The guilt about her past mistake was still there. She knew it always would be. But it had become manageable. She had learned to live with it, to balance it against the small good things she did every day. She didn't think about her old life very often anymore. She didn't wonder what her former colleagues were doing, didn't check the news from Chicago, didn't dwell on what might have been. She had made her choice 15 years ago, and she had built a new life from that choice. But sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, Susan would lie in bed and think about her skills going to waste. She had been so good at what she did. She had helped solve so many cases, had created systems that made law enforcement more effective, had used her technical expertise to make a real difference. Was driving a school bus important? Absolutely. Getting children safely to and from school was vital work. But it didn't use the specialized skills she had spent decades developing. Those skills were just sitting dormant now, unused and unneeded. Susan told herself that this was fine, that she had made the right choice, that using those skills again would mean taking on the kind of responsibility that had crushed her once before. Better to keep them tucked away, retired along with that chapter of her life. She had no way of knowing that very soon those skills would be needed again. That Maple Bay, her quiet sanctuary, was about to face a crisis that would require everything she had once been. Tuesday, November 19th, started like any other day. Susan woke at 5:30, made her coffee, did her stretches, and prepared for her morning route. The weather forecast had predicted rain, and sure enough, a steady drizzle was falling when she stepped outside at 7 o'clock. She grabbed her raincoat from the hook by the door and headed to her car. The streets of Maple Bay looked gray and dreary under the cloudy sky. The autumn leaves, so beautiful just weeks ago, were now wet and plastered to the sidewalks. But Susan didn't mind the rain. There was something cozy about it, something that made the warmth inside the bus feel even more welcoming. Her morning route went smoothly. The kids were a bit more subdued than usual. Rainy days seemed to make everyone quieter, but they all arrived on time at their stops. Emma Watson climbed aboard at Elm Street wearing a bright yellow raincoat and matching boots. "I like your boots," Susan said. "Thank you, Miss Perry. They have ducks on them, see?" Emma lifted one foot to show Susan the small duck pattern on the side of the boot. "Very nice," Susan said with a smile. By 8:30, she had dropped everyone off at school and was heading back to the depot. As she drove down Main Street, she noticed that the parking lot at Maple Bay Community Bank was already filling up. That was unusual for this early in the morning. The bank didn't even open until 9. Susan thought nothing of it. Maybe they were having some kind of special event or meeting. She continued to the depot, parked her bus, and headed to the break room for her usual mid-morning routine. Tom was there, as always, along with 2 other drivers, Denise and Khalil. They were all sitting around the small table, having coffee and talking about the weather. "Supposed to rain all week," Denise said, shaking her head. She was a woman in her early 40s with 3 kids of her own. "My youngest has a soccer tournament on Saturday. They'll be playing in mud." "Better than snow," Khalil said. He was the youngest of the drivers, only 32, and had moved to Maple Bay from Portland 2 years ago. "Give it another month and we'll be dealing with ice on the roads." Susan poured herself a cup of coffee and joined them. They chatted about various things: the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday, the new policies from the school district about bus safety drills, the rumor that the old mill building on the edge of town might be converted into apartments. It was comfortable and mundane, exactly the kind of conversation Susan had come to appreciate. No stress, no pressure, just colleagues passing time together. Around 10:30, Susan decided to take a walk into town. She needed to stop by the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, and the library had texted that a book she had requested was ready for pickup. She grabbed her raincoat and umbrella and headed out into the drizzle. Main Street was quiet, as it usually was on a Tuesday morning. A few cars were parked along the street, and she could see people moving around inside the shops. She waved to Bill Crawford through the window of the hardware store, and he waved back. As she approached the bank, she noticed that there were now several police cars in the parking lot. That was odd. Maple Bay only had a small police force, maybe 6 or 7 officers total. Having multiple cars at one location was unusual. Susan felt a small flutter of unease in her stomach. Old instincts, long dormant, began to stir. Something was wrong. She slowed her pace, trying to see what was happening. The bank's front door was closed, and she could see Officer Jim Peterson standing outside, keeping people back. Jim was one of the local officers, a man in his mid-40s who coached Little League and knew everyone in town. Susan walked up to him. "Jim? What's going on?" Jim turned to her, and she could see the stress on his face. "Susan, I need you to stay back, okay? We have a situation inside the bank." "What kind of situation?" Jim hesitated, then seemed to decide that there was no point in hiding it. Within an hour, everyone in town would know anyway. "Someone went into the bank right when it opened. They have a gun. They've taken hostages." Susan felt her heart rate spike. Hostages. A gun. In Maple Bay. It seemed impossible, like something from a different world, the world she had left behind. "How many hostages?" she heard herself ask. "We're not sure. Maybe 12 people? Employees and a few customers who were inside when it happened." Jim ran a hand through his hair, and Susan could see that he was shaken. This was probably the most serious situation he had dealt with in his entire career. "Chief Reynolds is inside trying to negotiate. We've called for backup from the county, but they're at least an hour away." Susan's mind was already working, analyzing the situation with the professional instincts she thought she had left behind. A small-town bank, morning hours, 12 hostages, limited local law enforcement. She wanted to ask more questions. What did the suspect want? Had anyone been hurt? What was the layout of the bank? But she held herself back. This wasn't her job anymore. She drove a school bus. She had left law enforcement behind for good reasons. Getting involved would mean taking on responsibility, would mean risking that her actions might lead to someone getting hurt. "I should let you work," Susan said, taking a step back. "I hope everyone comes out okay." "Thanks, Susan. And please, spread the word to stay away from this area. We don't need civilians getting in the way." Susan nodded and turned to leave. But as she walked away, her mind kept churning. 12 hostages. 1 suspect with a gun. Small-town police force with limited experience in this kind of situation. County backup an hour away. An hour was a long time in a hostage situation. A lot could go wrong in an hour. Susan tried to push the thoughts away. It wasn't her problem. It wasn't her responsibility. But the further she walked from the bank, the more agitated she felt. Years of training and experience couldn't just be switched off. She knew hostage situations. She knew crisis management. She knew how these things could go wrong, especially when handled by people who had never dealt with anything like this before. She made it 2 blocks before she stopped walking. She stood there on the sidewalk in the rain, umbrella in hand, and had a conversation with herself. "This isn't your job anymore," she said quietly. "You left this behind for a reason." But another voice in her head responded. "People are in danger. You have skills that could help. What if something goes wrong because you didn't act? What if something goes wrong because you do act? Remember what happened last time you made a mistake? That was different. That was a computer error. This is about using your experience, your knowledge. Susan stood there, torn. The old fears warred with a sense of duty she thought she had buried. Finally, she made a decision. She would go home and stay out of it. The police could handle this. Chief Reynolds was a good man, competent and level-headed. The county would send help. Everything would be fine. She turned and walked back toward her car at the depot. Every step felt heavy, as if she were walking through mud. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking slightly. She sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm herself. Then her phone buzzed. It was a text from Margaret at the library. "Susan, have you heard? There's a situation at the bank. They're saying someone has a gun and hostages. I'm scared. Some of my friends work at that bank." Susan stared at the text. Friends. Real people that Margaret knew. That Susan probably knew too. She tried to remember who worked at the Maple Bay Community Bank. There was Patricia Morris, the branch manager. She came to the community potlucks sometimes. And young Danny Sullivan, who had just graduated from the community college and started as a teller. His mother, Martha, owned the flower shop. These weren't abstract people. They were her neighbors, part of her community. Susan took a deep breath. Then another. Then she made a different decision. She started her car and drove, not toward home, but toward the town's municipal building. If she was going to do this, she needed information, and the municipal building had something that might help. The Maple Bay Municipal Building was a modest two-story structure that housed various town offices, including the mayor's office, the town clerk, and the small IT department that managed the town's limited technology infrastructure. Susan had been here many times before, usually to help with computer problems or to attend town hall meetings. She parked her car and hurried inside, shaking the rain from her umbrella. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly, looked up from her desk with a worried expression. "Susan, have you heard about the bank?" "I have," Susan said. "Is anyone from the IT department here?" "I think Terry is upstairs. Why?" "I need to talk to him about something. It's important." Kelly looked curious but didn't ask questions. "Go on up. You know where the office is." Susan climbed the stairs to the second floor. The IT department was really just one large room with several desks and computer equipment. Terry Morrison, the town's sole IT specialist, was there, looking worried and distracted. Terry was in his late 20s, a tech-savvy young man who had grown up in Maple Bay and returned after college to help his hometown modernize its systems. Susan had helped him several times with various projects. He respected her technical knowledge, though he had no idea about her professional background. "Terry," Susan said, entering the room, "I need your help with something." Terry looked up. "Susan, hi. Sorry, I'm kind of distracted. Did you hear about what's happening at the bank?" "I did. That's actually why I'm here. I need to ask you about the town's camera system." Maple Bay had installed a network of traffic and security cameras around town a few years ago. It was a modest system, nothing like what you'd find in a big city, but it covered the main intersections and key areas of downtown. Terry managed the system as part of his job. "What about it?" Terry asked. Susan took a breath. This was it. The moment where she either committed to helping or walked away. "Can the cameras see the bank?" Terry nodded slowly. "Yeah, there are 2 cameras that have views of the bank, one at the Main Street intersection and one at the corner of Main and 4th. Why?" "I want to access those feeds. I think they might help the police understand what's happening." Terry looked confused. The police already have access. Chief Reynolds can call me any time to get the feeds. Though I don't think he's called yet. Can I see them? Right now? Terry hesitated. Susan, I'm not supposed to just show camera feeds to civilians. It's a privacy issue. Susan made a quick decision. If she was going to do this, she needed to be honest with Terry. At least partially honest. Terry, I need to tell you something. Before I came to Maple Bay, I worked in law enforcement. I was a system analyst for the Chicago Police Department. I have experience with crisis situations and security systems. I think I might be able to help. Terry's eyes widened. You were a cop? Not exactly. I worked behind the scenes on the technical side, but I understand how these situations work. Please, Terry, let me see the feeds. If I can see anything useful, I'll call Chief Reynolds directly. The cameras aren't going to violate anyone's privacy. They're just showing public streets. Terry chewed his lip, thinking. Then he nodded. Okay, I'll pull them up. He turned to his computer and brought up the camera system interface. Within moments, 2 video feeds appeared on his screen. Both showed views of Main Street near the bank. Susan leaned in, studying the feeds carefully. The first camera, at the Main Street intersection, showed the front of the bank and the parking lot. She could see the police cars, the officers keeping people back, and the bank's closed front door. The second camera, at the corner, showed a side view of the bank and part of the alley behind it. Can you rewind these to when the bank opened this morning? Susan asked. Terry manipulated the controls and the footage jumped backward. Susan watched carefully as the timeline rolled back to 9 a.m. She saw the bank opening, a few cars in the parking lot, employees arriving. Then, at exactly 9:03 a.m., a blue sedan pulled up. A man got out. He was wearing jeans and a dark jacket. He looked around nervously, then walked quickly toward the bank entrance. Can you pause there? Susan asked. And zoom in on his face, if possible? Terry paused the feed and zoomed in. The image quality wasn't great, but Susan could make out the man's features. He was maybe 40 years old, with dark hair and a thin face. He looked scared more than angry. Can you email this screenshot to me? Susan asked, giving Terry her email address. Sure, but why? I want to see if I can find out who he is. The more information the police have about the suspect, the better they can negotiate. Terry sent the screenshot, and Susan opened it on her phone. She studied the man's face. Something about his expression tugged at her memory, but she couldn't place it. Is there any way to see if there are cameras on the surrounding streets? Susan asked. I want to see where he came from. Terry shook his head. The cameras only cover downtown. We don't have coverage on the residential streets. Susan nodded, thinking. She looked back at the live feeds. The situation looked static. Police outside, hostages presumably inside. No movement. That could be good or bad. Good because it meant things hadn't escalated. Bad because it meant the negotiation wasn't progressing. Terry, I need you to do something for me, Susan said. I need you to give me access to these camera feeds on my phone. What? I can't do that. The system isn't set up for remote access. Can you set it up? It's just a matter of creating a secure connection, right? You have the technical capability. Terry looked uncertain. Well, yeah, technically I could, but Susan, I could get in trouble for this. I'm not going to do anything illegal with it, Susan assured him. I just want to monitor the situation, and if I see anything the police should know about, I'll call them immediately. That's all. I'm trying to help. Terry wavered. Susan could see the conflict on his face. Finally, he sighed. Okay, but if anyone asks, I didn't do this. and if you get in trouble, I had no idea you were going to use it this way." Fair enough. Terry worked for about 10 minutes, setting up a secure login for Susan and installing a viewing app on her phone. When he was done, Susan could see both camera feeds on her phone screen. "Thank you, Terry. I really appreciate this. Just be careful, okay? And really, if you see anything important, tell the police." "I will, I promise." Susan left the municipal building and walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat, staring at the camera feeds on her phone. She was committed now. She had crossed the line from concerned citizen to active participant. But she still wasn't sure what she could actually do. Watching camera feeds was one thing. Actually helping was another. She needed more information. She needed to understand what was happening inside that bank, who the suspect was, what he wanted. And she needed to figure out if there was anything she could do with her skills that would actually make a difference. Susan drove home, her mind racing. Once inside her cottage, she set up her laptop at the kitchen table and began to work. First, she took the screenshot of the suspect's face and used an image search to see if she could find any matches online. Nothing came up immediately, which wasn't surprising. He wasn't a known criminal, at least not one with an online presence. Next, she opened a new search window and began looking for information about recent events in Maple Bay. She checked the local news website, the town's social media pages, and various community forums. She was looking for anything that might give her context about why this was happening. After about 20 minutes of searching, she found something interesting. 3 weeks ago, there had been a story in the local paper about medical debt crisis affecting several local families. One of the families mentioned was the Brooks family. They had significant medical bills from their daughter's treatment for a serious illness. The article mentioned that they were in danger of losing their house. Susan looked back at the screenshot of the suspect. Could he be related to the Brooks family? She searched for more information about them, found a few social media profiles, and then she found it. A photo from 2 years ago, a family picture. There was the man from the bank camera, smiling, his arm around a woman. The caption read, "Thanksgiving with my beautiful family. Grateful for every moment. David Brooks." David Brooks. That was the suspect's name. Susan felt a mixture of triumph at identifying him and sadness at the context. This wasn't a career criminal. This was a desperate man, probably drowning in debt, who had made a terrible choice. She picked up her phone and called the police station. The dispatcher answered. "Maple Bay Police Department." "Hi, this is Susan Perry. I need to speak with Chief Reynolds. It's about the situation at the bank." "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the chief is unavailable. He's dealing with an ongoing incident." "I know. That's why I'm calling. I have information that might help." There was a pause. "What kind of information?" "I think I know who the suspect is. His name is David Brooks. He lives here in town. I believe he's acting out of desperation, not malice." Another pause. "How do you know this?" "I did some research. Please, I need to talk to someone who's handling the situation. This is important." "Hold on." Susan waited, her heart pounding. After about 2 minutes, a different voice came on the line. It was Officer Jim Peterson. "Susan? Jim here. The dispatcher said you have information?" "Jim, I think the suspect is David Brooks. He's a local resident who's been dealing with medical debt. His family was featured in a news article last month about families struggling with medical bills." "How do you know all this?" "I saw the camera footage from the municipal cameras and recognized him from the article." "Jim, if he's who I think he is, he's not a violent criminal. He's a father who's desperate. That might help with the negotiation. There was a long silence. Then Jim said, "Hold on. I'm going to relay this to Chief Reynolds. Don't hang up." Susan waited again. She could hear muffled voices in the background. Then Chief Reynolds came on the line. "Miss Perry, this is Chief Reynolds. Officer Peterson tells me you've identified our suspect?" "I believe so, yes. David Brooks. He lives on Sycamore Street with his wife and daughter. They've been struggling with medical debt. And how did you come by this information?" Susan hesitated. She needed to be careful here. "I saw the camera footage at the municipal building and did some online research. Chief, I want to help if I can. I have experience with these situations." "What kind of experience?" This was the moment. Susan took a deep breath. "I used to work for the Chicago Police Department. I was a system analyst in the Digital Forensics Division. I've been involved in crisis situations before. I know I'm not a police officer, but I have skills that might be useful." There was a long pause. Susan could almost hear Chief Reynolds processing this information, trying to decide if she was someone who could help or someone who would just complicate things. Finally, he said, "Miss Perry, I appreciate you identifying the suspect. That is helpful. But this is a police matter. I need you to stay away from the bank and let us handle it." "Of course, but Chief, if there's anything I can do from a technical standpoint, monitoring systems, providing information, anything like that, please let me know. I want to help." "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you for calling." The line went dead. Susan set down her phone, feeling frustrated. She understood why Chief Reynolds had dismissed her. She was a civilian with no official role. But she also knew that the Maple Bay Police Department had limited resources and experience with this kind of situation. She looked back at her laptop screen, at the camera feed still showing on her phone. She had given them the suspect's name. That was something. But it didn't feel like enough. Susan stood up and paced around her small kitchen. She needed to think. What could she do that would actually make a difference? She couldn't go to the bank. She'd just be in the way. She couldn't negotiate. She had no authority or training in hostage negotiation. But she could gather information. She could monitor the situation. She could be ready to help if an opportunity presented itself. She sat back down and began to work systematically. First, she looked up everything she could find about David Brooks. Social media profiles, public records, anything that might give her insight into who he was and what might motivate him. The picture that emerged was sad and frustrating. David was 42 years old. He had worked at the lumber mill for 20 years before it closed down 2 years ago. His daughter, Emily, had been diagnosed with leukemia 3 years ago. The treatment had been successful. Emily was now in remission, but the medical bills had been catastrophic. Even with insurance, the family owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. David had found a new job at a warehouse, but it paid less than half what he'd made at the mill. His wife, Jennifer, worked part-time at the grocery store. They had sold their car, downsized their house, cut every expense they could. But it wasn't enough. According to the article Susan found, they were facing foreclosure. Susan's heart ached as she read about the family's struggles. This was exactly the kind of situation that drove good people to desperate acts. David Brooks wasn't evil. He was just a father who didn't know how else to save his family. She looked at the time. It was now almost noon. The situation at the bank had been going on for nearly 3 hours. The county backup had probably arrived by now, but there was no indication that anything had been resolved. Susan pulled up the camera feeds again. The scene looked the same. Police cars, officers, the closed bank door. Then she noticed something. There was movement at the back of the bank, visible in the second camera feed. An officer was positioning himself near the back entrance. Were they planning to go in? Susan felt a spike of alarm. If they tried a tactical entry and David panicked, people could get hurt. She needed more information. She needed to know what the police were planning. Susan made another decision. She got in her car and drove back toward Main Street. She parked several blocks away from the bank and walked carefully toward the police perimeter, staying well back but close enough to observe. She found a spot where she could see the front of the bank without being obvious. She watched the police officers moving around, coordinating with each other. She saw Chief Reynolds talking on his phone, looking stressed and tired. As she watched, a vehicle arrived, a large van with County Police written on the side. Several officers got out, along with someone in tactical gear. This must be the specialized unit from the county. Susan watched as Chief Reynolds met with them. They talked for several minutes, the county officers gesturing and pointing at the bank. Then they began setting up equipment, what looked like communication gear and maybe tactical equipment. This wasn't good. The presence of tactical officers suggested they were preparing for different scenarios, including potentially going in by force. That was standard procedure, Susan knew, but it was also risky, especially with an amateur like David Brooks, someone who was desperate and scared. He might react unpredictably to an assault. Susan pulled out her phone and called the police station again. Maple Bay Police Department. This is Susan Perry again. I need to speak to Chief Reynolds. It's urgent. Ma'am, I already told you, the chief is busy. I understand, but I'm watching the situation, and I can see the tactical unit has arrived. I need to warn them about something. Watching the situation? Ma'am, you need to stay away from the bank. This is a dangerous situation. I'm nowhere near the bank. I'm several blocks away. But please, I need to speak to someone. David Brooks is an amateur. If you go in tactically, he's likely to panic. There are better approaches. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but you need to let the professionals handle this. I am a professional, Susan said, her frustration boiling over. I worked crisis situations for 25 years. I know what I'm talking about. Please, just let me speak to someone in command. There was a long silence. Then the dispatcher said, Hold on. Susan waited, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. After what felt like forever, a new voice came on the line. This is Commander Walsh, County Police Tactical Unit. Who am I speaking with? My name is Susan Perry. I'm a resident of Maple Bay. I used to work for the Chicago Police Department as a system analyst. I've been involved in crisis situations before. Miss Perry, I appreciate your experience, but this is a law enforcement operation. Civilians need to stay clear. I understand that, Commander, but I know the suspect. Well, I know who he is. David Brooks. He's a local man with no criminal history. He's desperate because of medical debt. He's not a hardened criminal. If you go in hard, he's likely to react badly. We're aware of the suspect's identity, Commander Walsh said, and we're taking that into consideration in our planning. Are you planning a tactical entry? There was a pause. We're preparing for multiple scenarios, but that's all I can tell you. Now I need you to stay away from the area and let us do our job. Commander, please. I'm not trying to interfere. I just want to help. I have technical skills that might be useful. Access to the town's camera system, experience with crisis analysis. If you need information or support, I can provide it. We have our own resources, Miss Perry. Thank you for the offer, but we don't need assistance from civilians. And with that, the line went dead. Susan stood there, phone in hand, feeling utterly helpless. She understood the police position. They had protocols, training, resources. They didn't need some random person calling in with suggestions. But she also knew, deep in her bones, that something about this situation was wrong. The tactical approach wasn't right for this scenario. She needed to do something. But what? Susan looked down at her phone, at the camera feeds still running. She watched the tactical team setting up their equipment. And then an idea began to form. It was risky. It might not work. It might get her in serious trouble. But if it could help save lives, wasn't it worth trying? Susan took a deep breath, steeling herself. Then she walked quickly back to her car and drove home. She had work to do. Back at her cottage, Susan set up her laptop and pulled up every resource she could think of. She accessed the town's camera system through the login Terry had given her. She searched for any other public information that might be relevant. Building plans for the bank, available from the town hall's public records, utility maps, anything that could give her more information about the situation. The bank building was a single-story structure built in the 1980s, standard commercial construction. She found floor plans from when the building was originally permitted. One main lobby area, 3 teller stations, offices in the back, a vault room, and employee areas. 1 front entrance and 1 back entrance. Susan studied the plans carefully, memorizing the layout. Then she turned her attention back to the camera feeds. The tactical unit was still setting up. She could see them positioning equipment near the back of the building. That meant they were seriously considering a forced entry. Susan felt her anxiety growing. David Brooks was an amateur in a high-stress situation. If armed officers came bursting through the door, his first reaction would be panic. And a panicked person with a gun was dangerous. She needed to find a way to de-escalate the situation before it reached that point. But how? She wasn't there. She had no communication with anyone inside the bank. She had no official role or authority. Think, Susan. Use what you have. What did she have? She had access to the camera system. She had her technical skills. She had her experience with crisis situations. She had her knowledge of systems and networks. And then it hit her. The bank would have its own security system, cameras, alarm system, maybe computer networks. And many modern systems were connected to the internet for remote monitoring and management. Could she access the bank's internal systems? It would be technically illegal, of course. Unauthorized access to computer systems was a crime. But if it could help save lives... Susan wrestled with this ethical dilemma for about 30 seconds before deciding that 12 hostages' lives were more important than strictly following the law. She could deal with legal consequences later, if necessary. She began by searching for information about the bank's security system. A little creative searching led her to discover that Maple Bay Community Bank used a security system from SecureView Systems, a common commercial security provider. She knew SecureView. They had been around when she was still working in Chicago. Their systems had standard vulnerabilities, especially in older installations. Susan spent the next hour working methodically. She wouldn't describe exactly what she did. Some of it involved techniques she had learned in her law enforcement work, methods for accessing systems for investigative purposes. What mattered was that after an hour of careful work, she had access to the bank's internal security camera feeds. Suddenly, she could see inside the bank. There were 4 cameras, one covering the lobby, one covering the teller area, one in the back office area, and one covering the vault. Susan pulled up all 4 feeds on her laptop screen, arranging them so she could monitor everything at once. What she saw made her heart clench. In the main lobby, she could see the hostages. They were sitting on the floor, huddled together. She counted 11 people. It looked like 4 bank employees and 7 customers. They looked scared, but unhurt. That was good. David Brooks was pacing back and forth in front of them. He was holding a handgun. It looked like a small pistol, maybe a .38 caliber. His body language was agitated, nervous. He kept running his free hand through his hair and looking toward the windows. In the back office, she could see one more person, Chief Reynolds. He must have gone in to negotiate. He was sitting at a desk, talking on a phone. David would check on him periodically, clearly not wanting him to be out of sight for too long. Susan watched carefully, analyzing the situation. David's behavior suggested high stress, but not aggression. He wasn't threatening the hostages or waving the gun around. He was just trapped. Like an animal in a corner who didn't know how to get out. As Susan watched, David suddenly stopped pacing and shouted something at Chief Reynolds. She couldn't hear the audio, the security system didn't include sound, but she could read the frustration in David's body language. Chief Reynolds responded calmly, hands raised in a placating gesture. David shook his head violently and pointed the gun toward the ceiling. The hostages flinched. Chief Reynolds stood up slowly, speaking to David, clearly trying to calm him down. The situation was deteriorating. Susan made a quick decision. She picked up her phone and called the police station again. Maple Bay Police Department. This is Susan Perry. I need to speak to Commander Walsh immediately. Tell him I have eyes inside the bank. There was a surprised pause. What? I have access to the bank's internal security cameras. I can see the hostages, the suspect, and Chief Reynolds. I need to speak to Commander Walsh right now. Hold on. This time, the wait was shorter. Commander Walsh came on the line quickly. Miss Perry, what's this about having eyes inside? I accessed the bank's security system. I can see all the camera feeds from inside the building. I can provide you with real-time information about what's happening. How did you access the security system? His voice was sharp, suspicious. Does it matter? What matters is that I can help. Right now, I can see that David Brooks is becoming more agitated. Whatever negotiation is happening, it's not working. Chief Reynolds is in the back office, and David keeps checking on him. The hostages are in the lobby, on the floor. They appear unharmed. There was silence on the other end. Susan could imagine Commander Walsh trying to decide if she was crazy, if she was actually seeing what she claimed, or if this was somehow a trick. Can you prove you can see inside? He finally asked. Right now, David is wearing jeans and a black jacket. He's holding a small pistol in his right hand. He's standing near the teller counter. One of the hostages, a woman with blonde hair wearing a blue dress, is sitting slightly apart from the others. She looks like she might be the branch manager. Is that Patricia Morris? Another pause. Then, how are you seeing this? I told you. I accessed their security system. Look, Commander, we can discuss the legality of that later. Right now, what's important is that I can provide you with information you don't have. I can see the layout, the positions of everyone inside, David's behavior patterns. Why didn't you just call us and tell us you could do this from the start? Because I wasn't sure I could do it until I did it. And I knew you'd tell me not to try. But now I have access, and I'm offering to help. Susan could hear muffled conversation in the background, as if Commander Walsh was talking to someone else. Then he came back on the line. All right, Miss Perry. We're going to take you up on your offer, but you follow our instructions exactly. Understood? Understood. First, I need you to send us access to those camera feeds. Can you do that? Susan thought quickly. I can create a viewing link and send it to you. Give me your email address. Commander Walsh provided an email, and Susan quickly set up a secure viewing link and sent it to him. Within minutes, she received a call back. We've got the feeds, Commander Walsh said. This is incredibly helpful. Thank you. What's the status of the negotiation? Susan asked. Not good. David is demanding money, specifically enough to cover his medical debts, about $200,000. Obviously, we can't give him that much cash, even if the bank had it on hand, which they don't. Chief Reynolds is trying to talk him down, offering alternatives, but David isn't listening. Susan watched David on the camera feed. His pacing was becoming more frantic. He's escalating. His stress level is increasing. We're seeing that too. That's why we're preparing for a tactical entry. We're hoping to talk him down, but if the situation deteriorates further, we may need to go in. Commander, I strongly advise against that. David is an amateur with a gun. If you go in hard, he'll panic. Someone will get hurt, maybe killed. We're aware of the risks, Miss Perry, but we also can't let this situation go on indefinitely. We've been here for over 4 hours now. The longer it goes, the more likely something bad happens. Susan knew he was right. Time was both friend and enemy in hostage situations. More time meant more opportunity for negotiation, but it also meant more stress, more fatigue, more chance for mistakes. Let me think, Susan said. Maybe there's another way. She stared at the camera feeds, her mind working through possibilities. David wanted money he couldn't have. Chief Reynolds was trying to negotiate but not making progress. The tactical team was preparing to go in, which would likely end badly. What if there was a third option? Commander, what if we could communicate with David directly? Not through Chief Reynolds, but through another channel. What do you mean? The bank has computer systems. If I can access them, I might be able to send messages to the computers inside. David might be more willing to listen if the communication feels anonymous, less confrontational. That's unconventional and probably illegal. So is what I've already done, Susan pointed out. But it might work. Let me try something. If it doesn't work, you've lost nothing. But if it does, we might be able to resolve this without anyone getting hurt. She could hear Commander Walsh discussing this with someone else. Finally, he said, All right, try it. But keep us informed of everything you do. And Miss Perry, if this works, we'll have a long conversation about how you acquired these skills. Fair enough. Susan ended the call and turned her full attention to the bank's computer systems. She had already accessed their security system. Getting into their general network was only slightly more difficult. Within 20 minutes, she had access to the bank's internal computers. She could see which ones were currently active. One of them, she guessed, would be the computer in the office where Chief Reynolds was sitting. If she could send a message to that computer... But wait, that wasn't the right approach. She needed to communicate with David, not Chief Reynolds. And David was in the lobby. Susan studied the camera feeds again. There was a computer terminal at one of the teller stations visible in the lobby. If she could make that computer do something that would get David's attention... She had an idea. It was a bit theatrical, maybe even melodramatic, but sometimes drama was necessary to cut through panic. Susan accessed the teller station computer and opened the text-to-speech function that was built into the operating system. Then she carefully typed out a message. David Brooks, this is a friend. I can help you. Please sit down at this computer and read the screen. She activated the text-to-speech function at high volume. On the camera feed, she saw the computer suddenly speak the message in a robotic computer voice. David jumped, startled. He spun toward the sound, gun raised. The hostages gasped and huddled closer together. David stared at the computer, confused and alarmed. Susan watched, her heart pounding. Would he investigate, or would he panic? After a long moment, David slowly walked toward the computer terminal, keeping his gun raised. He looked at the screen. Susan had opened a text document there with a message. David, my name doesn't matter. What matters is that I know your situation and I want to help. You're not a criminal. You're a father who's desperate to save his family. I understand that. Please, sit down and let's talk. Type your response in this document. David read the message. He looked around the bank as if trying to figure out where this mysterious helper was. Then, slowly, he sat down at the terminal, gun still in his hand but pointed at the floor. He typed, "Who are you? Are you with the police?" Susan typed back, "I'm someone with technical skills who can see what's happening inside the bank. I'm not a police officer, but I'm working with them to help find a peaceful solution. No one wants anyone to get hurt, David. Not you, not the hostages, no one." David read the message, then typed, "I don't want to hurt anyone. I just need money. My family is going to lose everything. My daughter. We fought so hard to save her. I can't let us lose our home now." Susan felt her throat tighten as she read his words. This man wasn't evil. He was just broken and desperate. She typed, "I know about Emily, about her leukemia, about your medical bills. What you're going through is unfair and wrong. But David, this isn't the answer. You're not going to get $200,000 from this bank. Even if they could give it to you, you'd spend the rest of your life in prison. Emily needs her father. She needs you free and present in her life, not locked away." David's response was angry. "What else can I do? We've tried everything, sold everything. We're drowning. The bank is foreclosing next month. Where am I supposed to get that kind of money?" Susan thought carefully about how to respond. She needed to give him hope, but false hope would only make things worse. She typed, "I don't have all the answers, David, but I know there are better paths than this. There are debt relief organizations, medical debt forgiveness programs, community support. There are people who will help if you give them the chance. But first, you need to end this situation safely. Let the hostages go. Put down the gun. Talk to the police properly. Show them you're not a violent person, that you just made a mistake out of desperation." "They'll arrest me. I'll go to prison anyway." "Maybe. Probably. But there's a difference between robbing a bank and attempting to rob a bank where no one got hurt. There's a difference between being seen as a violent criminal and being seen as a desperate father who made a bad choice. Judges and juries are human too. If you surrender now, if you let everyone walk out safely, that will matter." There was a long pause. Susan watched David on the camera. He was sitting at the computer, staring at the screen, his shoulders slumped. He looked defeated and exhausted. Finally, he typed, "I'm scared." Susan's heart broke a little. She typed back, "I know you are. But you're stronger than you think. You fought for Emily when she was sick. You fought to keep your family together. You can fight through this, too. Do the right thing, David. End this peacefully. Show Emily that even when we make mistakes, we can still choose to do the right thing in the end." Another long pause. Then David typed, "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," Susan typed honestly. "But what choice do you have? You can't win this standoff, David. The police have surrounded the building. They have tactical units ready to come in. If you don't surrender soon, they're going to force their way in. And when that happens, people might get hurt. Maybe you. Maybe one of the hostages. Maybe one of the officers. Is that what you want? No. Then let's end this. Stand up. Tell the hostages they can leave. Put the gun down. Tell Chief Reynolds you're ready to surrender. Susan watched the camera feed, holding her breath. David sat motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he stood up. He walked into the middle of the lobby. The hostages looked up at him with frightened faces. Susan couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see his body language changing. The aggression and panic were draining away, replaced by something that looked like resignation and relief. He gestured to the hostages. They looked at each other uncertainly. Then, Patricia Morris, the bank manager, slowly stood up. The others followed her lead. David pointed toward the front door. They walked slowly, carefully, watching him. David didn't stop them. He just stood there, the gun hanging loosely at his side. One by one, the hostages reached the front door. Patricia opened it. Bright daylight flooded into the lobby. And then they were running out into the street, to safety. Susan could see activity on the exterior camera feeds as the hostages emerged. Police officers rushing forward to help them, to guide them to safety. Commander Walsh would be getting confirmation right now that the hostages were free. Inside the bank, David stood alone in the lobby. Chief Reynolds had emerged from the back office. He was talking to David, his hands raised, approaching slowly and carefully. David looked at the gun in his hand. Then, as Susan watched, he set it down on the floor. He kicked it away from himself. Then he knelt down, put his hands on his head, and waited. Chief Reynolds moved forward carefully, picking up the gun and securing it. Then he helped David to his feet and placed handcuffs on him. David didn't resist. He just stood there, his eyes closed, as if a great weight had finally been lifted. It was over. Susan sat back from her laptop, suddenly exhausted. Her hands were shaking. She had done it. She had helped end the situation peacefully. No one had been hurt. The hostages were safe. David was alive and in custody. And while he would face serious legal consequences, at least he hadn't compounded his mistakes by actually hurting anyone. Her phone rang. It was Commander Walsh. "Miss Perry, I don't know exactly what you did, but it worked. The hostages are safe, the suspect is in custody, and no one was hurt. We saw him sit down at the computer terminal. Were you communicating with him somehow?" "Yes," Susan admitted. "I accessed the bank's computers and talked to him through a text document. I convinced him to surrender." There was a long silence. Then Commander Walsh said, "That was highly irregular and probably illegal, but it saved lives. We're going to need to talk to you about all of this. Can you come down to the station?" "Of course. I'll be there in 15 minutes." Susan closed her laptop and sat for a moment in her quiet kitchen. Outside, the rain had finally stopped and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds. She had broken her 15-year retreat. She had used the skills she thought she'd left behind forever, and it had worked. But what happened now? When Susan arrived at the Maple Bay police station, she found it buzzing with activity. Officers were moving around, talking on phones, filling out reports. The hostage situation had been the biggest event in the town's recent history, and everyone was working to process what had happened. A young officer directed Susan to a conference room where Commander Walsh was waiting, along with Chief Reynolds and another person she didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s, wearing a professional suit. "Miss Perry," Commander Walsh said as she entered, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. Susan sat down across from them, feeling nervous. This was the part where she faced the consequences of her actions. Let me start by introducing everyone, Commander Walsh said. You know Chief Reynolds, of course. This is District Attorney Linda Morrison. She's here because what happened today raises some serious legal questions. Susan nodded, looking at DA Morrison. The woman's expression was neutral, professional, impossible to read. Miss Perry, Chief Reynolds began, what you did today was extraordinary. You helped save lives. All 12 hostages are safe and unharmed. David Brooks is in custody and will face charges, but he's alive and no one was hurt. We owe you a debt of gratitude. However, Commander Walsh continued, you also did some things that are legally questionable. Accessing computer systems without authorization is a crime. We need to understand exactly what you did and how you did it. Susan took a deep breath. I understand. I'll tell you everything. But first, I need to know, is David Brooks okay? What's going to happen to him? Chief Reynolds exchanged a glance with DA Morrison, who nodded slightly. He's being held on charges of attempted robbery, kidnapping, and several other felonies, Chief Reynolds said. He'll be arraigned tomorrow. But given that no one was hurt and he surrendered peacefully, there may be room for some leniency. His family, Susan said. His daughter. Will someone make sure they're okay? His wife has been notified, Chief Reynolds said gently. And actually, something interesting has already happened. When news got out about why David did what he did, the community response has been remarkable. Patricia Morris, the bank manager who was one of the hostages, has already started a fundraiser for the Brooks family's medical debts. Within the last 2 hours, it's raised over $50,000. Susan felt tears prick her eyes. This was Maple Bay at its best. People helping people in trouble. Now, DA Morrison said, speaking for the first time, let's talk about you, Miss Perry, or should I say Susan Perry, former system analyst for the Chicago Police Department. So they had already looked into her background. Susan wasn't surprised. Yes, she said, that's who I am, or who I was. Why didn't you tell anyone in Maple Bay about your background? Morrison asked. Susan considered her answer carefully. Because I retired from that life. I made a mistake in my old job. A technical error that had serious consequences. Someone got hurt because of my mistake. I couldn't handle the responsibility anymore, so I left. I came here to start over, to live a quieter life where my mistakes couldn't hurt people. But today you used those same skills again, Commander Walsh pointed out. Yes, because people were in immediate danger, and I knew I could help. I wrestled with the decision, believe me, but in the end I couldn't stand by and do nothing when I had the ability to make a difference. Let's talk about what you actually did, DA Morrison said. You accessed the town's camera system. How? Terry Morrison, the town IT specialist, gave me access. I told him I had law enforcement experience and might be able to help. He agreed to let me see the camera feeds. And the bank's security system? Susan hesitated. This was where things got legally complicated. I used techniques I learned in my law enforcement work to access their security cameras. I needed to see what was happening inside. That's unauthorized computer access, Morrison said. A felony. I know. I made a choice to break the law because I believed it was necessary to save lives. And then you accessed the bank's computer systems and communicated directly with the suspect, also unauthorized access. Yes. Again, I believed it was necessary. I thought I could reach David in a way that traditional negotiation wasn't reaching him. And it worked. D.A. Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Susan. You put me in a difficult position, Miss Perry. On one hand, what you did was clearly illegal. If I don't prosecute, it sets a precedent that vigilante hacking is acceptable if someone thinks they're helping. On the other hand, you genuinely did help. You saved lives. Your actions led to a peaceful resolution of a dangerous situation. Susan met her gaze steadily. I understand your position. I'll accept whatever consequences you decide are appropriate. I don't regret what I did, but I also understand that rules exist for reasons. There was a long silence in the room. Finally, Chief Reynolds spoke. D.A. Morrison, may I make a suggestion? Morrison nodded. What if instead of prosecution, we explore other options? Miss Perry clearly has valuable skills that could benefit this community in a legal, official capacity. What if we hired her as a consultant? Someone who could help us with technical matters, someone who could provide expertise we currently lack. Commander Walsh nodded thoughtfully. That's actually a good idea. Most small-town police departments don't have anyone with serious technical skills. Miss Perry could fill a real gap. D.A. Morrison considered this. That could work. Miss Perry, would you be willing to act as a technical consultant for local law enforcement? Not as a full-time position, but on a contract basis when your skills are needed? Susan thought about this. It would mean stepping back into that world, at least partially. But it would also mean using her skills legitimately, helping people without the burden of full-time responsibility that had crushed her before. I'd be willing to do that, she said slowly, as long as it doesn't interfere with my primary job. I'm still a school bus driver, and that's important to me. I don't see why it would, Chief Reynolds said. We're not looking for a full-time employee, just someone we can call on when we need technical expertise, which, frankly, isn't that often in a town like Maple Bay. Today was an anomaly. Then yes, Susan said, I'll do it. D.A. Morrison nodded. All right, here's what I'm willing to offer. I'll decline to prosecute the unauthorized computer access charges, given the extraordinary circumstances and the outcome. In return, you'll serve as a technical consultant to local law enforcement. We'll draw up a proper contract, pay you a reasonable consulting fee when your services are needed, and everything will be official and legal going forward. That's more than fair, Susan said, feeling relief wash over her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Morrison said with a slight smile. I'm also going to require you to give a series of presentations to regional law enforcement about computer security and technical investigation techniques. If you have this kind of knowledge, other departments should benefit from it too. Susan nodded. I can do that. They spent the next hour going over the details of what had happened, documenting everything for the official reports. Susan explained her technical processes in general terms, careful not to reveal specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by criminals. She described her communication with David Brooks, what she had said to convince him to surrender. When they were finally done, Chief Reynolds walked Susan out of the station. Susan, he said as they stood in the parking lot, I want to thank you personally, not just for today, but for the way you handled this whole situation. You could have pushed yourself forward, demanded to be involved, made things more complicated. Instead, you worked behind the scenes, provided help where it was needed, and let the professionals do their jobs. That shows real wisdom. I just did what I thought was right, Susan said. That's exactly my point. You have strong moral judgment. That's rare. He paused, then added, I have to ask, why didn't you tell anyone about your background? You've been here 15 years. That's a long time to keep something like that secret. Susan looked out across the parking lot, gathering her thoughts. I was ashamed. I made a mistake in my old job that hurt someone. I couldn't forgive myself for it, so I ran away. I thought if I left that world behind, I could leave the guilt behind, too. Did it work? Not really. The guilt came with me. But the simpler life here in Maple Bay, that helped. It gave me space to heal, even if I never fully forgave myself. And now? Susan considered the question. Now, I don't know. Today showed me that I still have value in that world, that my skills can still help people. Maybe I've been punishing myself unnecessarily all these years. Chief Reynolds smiled. I think you have been. Everyone makes mistakes, Susan. What matters is what we do after we make them. And from what I can see, you've spent 15 years being a good person, a good neighbor, and a good member of this community. That counts for something. Susan felt emotion welling up in her chest. Thank you, she managed to say. Go home and get some rest, Chief Reynolds said kindly. You've had a hell of a day. Susan drove home in a daze. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her exhausted and emotionally raw. But there was also a sense of, not quite peace, but maybe the beginning of it. Something had shifted inside her today. When she pulled up to her cottage, she saw someone sitting on her front step. It was Margaret from the library. Susan! Margaret jumped up and hurried over as Susan got out of her car. I've been trying to call you. Are you okay? I heard you were somehow involved in what happened at the bank. I'm fine, Susan said. And yes, I was involved. It's a long story. Come inside and tell me, Margaret said firmly, taking Susan's arm. You look exhausted. When was the last time you ate? Susan realized she couldn't remember. Breakfast? That felt like a lifetime ago. Inside the cottage, Margaret took charge, making tea and putting together a simple meal from what she could find in Susan's kitchen. As they ate, Susan told her the whole story. Her background in Chicago, the mistake that had driven her away, her decision to help today, and the outcome. Margaret listened without interrupting, her eyes growing wider as the story unfolded. When Susan finished, Margaret sat back in her chair and shook her head in amazement. All these years, she said, I've known you as just Susan, the bus driver, the quiet woman who volunteers at the library and tends her garden. And all this time you had this whole other life, these incredible skills. I wasn't trying to deceive anyone, Susan said. I just wanted to be someone different, someone simpler. I understand, Margaret said. We all have pasts. Some of us just have more dramatic pasts than others. She reached across the table and squeezed Susan's hand. I'm proud of you. What you did today was brave or foolish. Brave and foolish aren't mutually exclusive. But the point is, you helped save lives. That matters more than anything else. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their tea. Finally, Margaret said, So what happens now? Are you going to keep driving the bus? Yes, Susan said firmly. That's still my job. That's still important. But I'll also be consulting for the police when they need help. A foot in both worlds, I guess. That sounds perfect for you, Margaret said. You always were good at balancing things. After Margaret left, Susan took a long, hot shower and collapsed into bed. She was asleep within minutes, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep that she desperately needed. Part 7. A New Normal. The next few days were surreal. News of the hostage situation and Susan's role in resolving it spread through Maple Bay like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to her, to hear the story firsthand, to thank her for her help. Susan found it uncomfortable and overwhelming. She had spent 15 years being quietly invisible, and now she was the center of attention. People would stop her on the street, in the grocery store, at the library. Everyone had questions. Everyone had opinions. Everyone wanted to shake her hand and tell her how proud they were. "I preferred being anonymous," Susan said to Tom at the bus depot a few days after the incident. They were sitting in the break room during their mid-morning break. "Too late for that now," Tom said with a grin. "You're a local celebrity. Maple Bay's very own hero." "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone with my skills would have done." "That's exactly what a hero would say," Tom pointed out. On Thursday, when Susan went to her volunteer shift at the library, she found a surprise waiting. The library was full of people, far more than usually came to a regular Thursday evening. Margaret was standing in the front, grinning. "What's going on?" Susan asked, confused. "We're honoring you," Margaret said. "The library board wanted to do something to show our appreciation, so we're dedicating our new computer lab to you." Susan looked around and saw that they had indeed set up a new computer lab in what had been a storage room. 5 computers on desks, all new equipment. A sign on the wall read, "The Susan Perry Technology Center." I don't know what to say," Susan stammered. "Just say thank you and cut the ribbon," Margaret said, handing her a pair of scissors and gesturing to a ribbon stretched across the entrance to the room. Susan cut the ribbon to applause from the gathered crowd. Afterwards, people came up to thank her, to ask her about technology questions, to express their gratitude for what she had done. It was touching and embarrassing in equal measure. "I'm glad people appreciate you," Margaret said later, after the crowd had dispersed. "But I can tell this attention is hard for you." "I'm not used to it," Susan admitted. "I liked being in the background." "You'll always be my friend Susan, no matter how many computer labs they name after you," Margaret said warmly. That Sunday, Susan attended the community church service. She wasn't particularly religious, but she sometimes went to the services because they were a nice way to connect with the community. This week, Pastor Williams mentioned the hostage situation and asked everyone to pray for David Brooks and his family, as well as for the hostages who had been traumatized by the experience. After the service, Patricia Morris, the bank manager who had been one of the hostages, approached Susan. "Miss Perry," she said, "I wanted to thank you personally. We were all so scared. When you started communicating with David through that computer, giving him a way to surrender, you saved us." "I'm just glad everyone is safe," Susan said. "The fundraiser for the Brooks family is up to $180,000 now," Patricia said. "It's amazing how this community has come together. We're going to be able to help them pay off their medical debts and keep their house. Something good is coming out of this terrible situation." "That's wonderful," Susan said, genuinely moved. "How is David doing?" "His lawyer says he'll likely plead guilty to reduced charges. Given that no one was hurt and he surrendered peacefully, they're hoping for a sentence that includes counseling and community service rather than serious prison time. And David's wife, Jennifer, has been in touch. She wanted me to tell you thank you for talking to her husband, for helping him see a way out." That conversation stayed with Susan for days. She had helped save lives, and helped a desperate family find hope again. Maybe her skills weren't a curse after all. Maybe they were a gift that she had been too afraid to use. Her morning bus routes continued as normal, providing a comforting routine amid all the changes. The kids on her bus were fascinated by her sudden fame, asking her endless questions. "Miss Perry, did you really hack into the bank's computers?" Jake Peterson asked one morning. "I accessed their systems in order to help end a dangerous situation," Susan said carefully. "But that's not something you should ever try to do. It's illegal unless you have a very good reason and proper authorization." "But you're like a secret agent," his twin brother Luke said enthusiastically. "I'm a bus driver," Susan said firmly. "Just like always." "A bus driver who's also a computer expert and saved people from a bad guy," Emma Watson chimed in. "That's even better than a regular bus driver." Susan couldn't help but smile. "Well, when you put it that way." 2 weeks after the hostage incident, Susan received her first official request for consultation from Chief Reynolds. A local business had been the victim of a cyber attack, and they needed someone to help them understand what had happened and how to prevent it in the future. Susan met with the business owner, a woman named Carol who ran a small accounting firm, and examined their computer systems. She quickly identified the problem, a phishing email that had compromised their passwords. She helped them secure their systems, change their protocols, and set up better security measures. It felt good to use her skills again in a legitimate, helpful way. And it was a simple problem with a clear solution. No life or death stakes, no pressure that might lead to catastrophic mistakes. "Thank you so much," Carol said when Susan finished. "I was terrified we'd lost all our client data." "You're welcome," Susan said. "Just remember to train your employees about phishing emails and suspicious links. Most cybersecurity is about being careful and aware." As autumn turned to winter, Susan found her new rhythm. She drove her bus routes every morning and afternoon. She volunteered at the library on Thursday evenings. She did occasional technical consulting work for local businesses and the police department. She tended her garden in the spring and baked cookies for community events. Her past was no longer a secret, but it was also no longer a source of shame. She had integrated the two parts of her identity, the technical expert she had been and the simple bus driver she had become. She was both, and that was okay. In December, David Brooks was sentenced. He pled guilty to attempted robbery and received 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. He would not go to prison. The judge cited his lack of criminal history, his genuine remorse, and the fact that no one had been hurt as reasons for the lenient sentence. He also mentioned the community's support for the Brooks family and their efforts to help them with their medical debts. Susan attended the sentencing hearing. Afterward, David approached her in the hallway outside the courtroom. "Miss Perry," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for talking me down that day, for helping me see that there was another way." "I'm glad you listened," Susan said simply. "My daughter Emily, she's doing well. And thanks to the community fundraiser, we're going to keep our house. We're going to be okay." He paused, then added, "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for what I did, being the kind of father Emily deserves." "That's all anyone can do," Susan said. "Learn from our mistakes and do better going forward." David nodded and walked away to rejoin his family. Susan watched them go. David, his wife Jennifer, and their daughter Emily, a slight girl with a bright smile despite everything she'd been through. They were holding hands, staying together, moving forward. Maybe that was all any of them could do. Stay together, support each other, and keep moving forward. Christmas in Maple Bay was beautiful that year. The town square was decorated with lights and a large Christmas tree. The community center hosted its annual holiday party, and Susan brought her chocolate chip cookies, which were as popular as ever. On Christmas Eve, Susan sat in her cottage with Margaret, drinking hot chocolate and watching the snow fall outside. It had been a tumultuous few months, but Susan felt more at peace than she had in years. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "when I first met you 15 years ago, you seemed like someone who was running from something. I never pried, but I always wondered what you were running from." "I was running from myself," Susan said, "from my mistakes and my guilt." "And now?" Susan considered the question. "Now I'm learning to stop running, to accept all parts of who I am, the mistakes and the skills, the failures and the successes. I'm learning that you can't outrun your past, but you can learn to live with it." "That's a good lesson," Margaret said. "Maybe the best one." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow. Susan thought about her journey, from the driven system analyst in Chicago to the quiet bus driver in Maple Bay, and now to someone who was both and neither. Someone who had found a way to integrate the different parts of herself. She thought about David Brooks and his family, about the hostages who had been terrified but were now safe, about all the small ways she helped her community every day. She thought about Emma Watson and the Peterson twins and all the other kids she drove to school each morning, keeping them safe. She thought about the mistake she had made 15 years ago, the one that had sent her running. She still felt sad about it, still wished she could change it. But she no longer let it define her entire existence. It was part of her story, but not the whole story. "Thank you," Susan said to Margaret. "For what?" "For being my friend. For accepting me as I am, both before you knew my past and after." Margaret smiled and raised her mug of hot chocolate. "To friendship. And to quiet heroes who drive buses and save lives and make the best chocolate chip cookies in Maple Bay." Susan laughed and clinked her mug against Margaret's. "To friendship." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Maple Bay in peaceful white. Inside Susan's cottage, all was warm and calm. She was home. Not the home she had left behind in Chicago, but a new home, one she had built for herself through years of quiet service and gentle healing. And for the first time in 15 years, Susan felt like she truly belonged. Not despite her past, but because of it. Her mistakes had led her here. Her skills had helped save lives. Her choices had shaped her into who she was now. She was Susan Perry, bus driver and technical consultant, volunteer and community member. Someone who had made mistakes and learned from them. Someone who had run away and found her way back. She was simply herself, and that was enough. Epilogue. Spring returns. Spring came to Maple Bay with its usual gentle beauty. The snow melted, revealing the first green shoots of new growth. Susan planted her garden, tomatoes again, plus some peppers and herbs this year. She found satisfaction in the simple act of pushing seeds into the soil, knowing that with time and care, they would grow. It was April now, almost 5 months since the hostage situation. Life had returned to its comfortable rhythm, with some new elements added. Susan still drove her bus routes, still volunteered at the library, still attended community events. But now she also consulted on technical matters for local businesses and occasionally helped the police department with computer-related issues. The balance felt right. She had enough engagement with her old skills to feel useful and challenged, but not so much responsibility that it overwhelmed her. She was helping people without bearing the crushing weight that had broken her before. One Tuesday morning, as she picked up Emma Watson at the corner of Elm Street, the little girl had news to share. "Miss Perry, guess what? My science project won second place in the regional competition." "That's wonderful, Emma. What was your project about?" "Butterfly migration patterns. Remember when we talked about monarch butterflies way back in November? That's what got me interested. So I did my whole project on how they navigate thousands of miles to the same places every year." Susan felt a warm glow of happiness. Such a small conversation, months ago, and it had sparked something in this bright young girl. That was the kind of difference she made every day, in small ways that might seem insignificant, but added up to something meaningful. "I'm so proud of you," Susan said sincerely. "You should be very proud of yourself, too." As she drove her route that morning, Susan reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The maple trees that gave the town its name were budding now, preparing to unfold their leaves and create the canopy of green that would shade Main Street all summer. That afternoon, after finishing her bus routes, Susan stopped by the bank. She needed to deposit a check from her consulting work, but she also wanted to see how everyone was doing. Patricia Morris greeted her warmly. "Susan, how are you?" "I'm well, thanks. How's everyone here? How are you doing?" "We're good," Patricia said. "It took a while, but we've all processed what happened. Some of the staff did counseling, which helped. And honestly, the outcome of the situation, how the community came together to help the Brooks family, that helped too. It's easier to heal when you can see something good come from something scary." "How is the Brooks family doing?" Susan asked. "Really well, actually. David completed his community service hours. He's working at the community center now, teaching a class about financial literacy and helping people understand medical billing and insurance, turning his own struggles into something that helps others." "That's wonderful," Susan said, genuinely pleased. As she left the bank, Susan saw David Brooks himself across the street, putting up a poster for his class at the community center. She waved, and he waved back with a genuine smile. He looked different from the desperate, frightened man she had seen on the security cameras that November day. He looked like someone who had found his way through darkness, back into the light. Later that evening, Susan attended the weekly community dinner at the center. She found herself sitting with a diverse group: Margaret from the library, Tom from the bus depot, Carol from the accounting firm she had helped, and surprisingly, Commander Walsh from the county police. "Commander," Susan said, surprised. "I didn't know you came to these dinners." "I don't usually," Walsh admitted, "but I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. I'm glad I did. The food is excellent. And I wanted to talk to you about something, actually." "Oh?" "We're starting a regional program to help small-town police departments with technical training. Given your experience and your success here, we'd like you to be one of the instructors. It would be 1 weekend a month, teaching officers about digital forensics, cybersecurity, that sort of thing." Susan considered this. 1 weekend a month was manageable, and teaching felt right. It was a way to share her knowledge without taking on operational responsibility. "I'd be interested," she said. "Let me think about it and get back to you." "Of course, no pressure, but I think you'd be great at it." After dinner, as people were cleaning up, Mayor Thompson, A man in his 60s who had been mayor of Maple Bay for the past decade approached Susan. "Miss Perry, could I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, Mayor." They walked outside into the pleasant spring evening. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear as the light faded. "I wanted to thank you," Mayor Thompson said, "not just for what you did in November, but for what you've been doing for the past 15 years. You've been a quiet pillar of this community, reliable, helpful, kind. And then when crisis came, you stepped up in an extraordinary way. You represent the best of what Maple Bay is." Susan felt herself blushing. "I just did what I could." "That's my point. You always do what you can. Every day, in small ways and big ways. The town council wanted you to know that you're appreciated. We're planning to honor you at the Memorial Day celebration next month. I hope you'll accept." "I'm honored," Susan said. "Thank you." Walking home later, under the emerging stars, Susan thought about the mayor's words. She had spent so many years thinking of herself as someone who had failed, someone running from her mistakes. But maybe that wasn't the full story. Maybe she was also someone who had found a way to rebuild, to serve, to matter. When she reached her cottage, she sat on her front step for a while, enjoying the cool evening air. She could hear the distant sound of the ocean. Maple Bay was only a few miles from the coast, and on quiet nights like this, you could hear the waves. 15 years ago, she had arrived in this town broken and ashamed, looking for a place to hide. Instead, she had found a place to heal. She had found community, friendship, purpose. She had found a way to be useful without being crushed by responsibility. She thought about the old Susan, the driven analyst in Chicago who had worked herself to exhaustion, who had been so afraid of making mistakes that a single error had destroyed her. That Susan had been strong but brittle, able to bend but breaking when pushed too far. The new Susan, or maybe the evolved Susan, was different. She had learned flexibility. She had learned that mistakes were part of being human. She had learned that you could fall apart and put yourself back together, and that the rebuilt version might actually be stronger than the original, because it had learned where the weak points were. She had also learned that heroism wasn't always dramatic. It wasn't always about grand gestures or spectacular saves. Sometimes it was about showing up every day, doing the small things well, being reliable and kind. Driving children safely to school was heroic. Helping elderly people learn to use computers was heroic. Being a good neighbor, a good friend, a good member of a community. All of that was heroic in its own quiet way. And yes, sometimes heroism was about stepping up in a crisis, using your skills to help people in danger. But that was just one kind of heroism, not better or more important than the everyday kind. Susan went inside, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. She opened her email and drafted a message to Commander Walsh, accepting the teaching position. Then she opened a new document and began making notes for her first class. What would be most useful for small-town officers to know about digital forensics? What basics should they understand about cybersecurity? As she worked, she felt a sense of satisfaction and purpose that she hadn't felt in years. Her skills weren't wasted. Her experience wasn't meaningless. She had found a way to use what she knew to help people, without taking on more than she could handle. There was a knock at her door. Susan looked up, surprised. It was almost 9 o'clock, a bit late for visitors. She went to the door and found Margaret standing there, holding a bottle of wine and looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," Margaret said, "but I had a thought and couldn't wait until tomorrow to share it. Can I come in?" "Of course," Susan said, stepping aside to let her friend in. Margaret set the wine bottle on the counter and turned to Susan with excitement in her eyes. "I was thinking about the library's technology center, the one we named after you. And I thought, what if we expanded the program? What if we offered classes not just for seniors, but for everyone in the community? Digital literacy, online safety, basic coding for kids. You could teach some of the classes, and we could bring in other instructors too." Susan felt a spark of interest. "That's a great idea. There's a real need for that kind of education, especially in smaller communities." "Right! And we could apply for grants to fund it, make it free for anyone who wants to learn. It could be our contribution to making sure everyone in Maple Bay has the skills they need for the modern world." They spent the next hour talking through the possibilities, drinking wine and getting more excited about the idea. By the time Margaret left, they had outlined a basic plan and agreed to present it to the library board next week. After Margaret left, Susan got ready for bed, feeling energized despite the late hour. She lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, thinking about the future. For so many years, she had been focused on the past, on her mistake, her guilt, her need to escape. But now, finally, she was looking forward. There were things to build, programs to create, people to teach, children to transport safely to school each day. There was a life to live, rich and full and meaningful. She thought about young Emma Watson and her butterfly project. Monarch butterflies migrated thousands of miles, navigating by instinct and determination. They faced hardships and challenges, but they kept going, driven by something deeper than conscious thought. And when they reached their destination, they created something beautiful. A whole new generation of butterflies that would make the same journey. Maybe Susan was like those butterflies. She had migrated from her old life to this new one, traveling a hard road, facing her own challenges and hardships. And now she was creating something beautiful. Not a new generation of butterflies, but a new version of herself. One that honored both who she had been and who she had become. She was Susan Perry. She was 65 years old. She drove a school bus and consulted on technical matters. She volunteered at the library and baked cookies for community events. She had made mistakes and learned from them. She had run away and found her way back. She was quiet and ordinary and extraordinary all at once. And she was exactly where she needed to be. As Susan drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of gratitude. Gratitude for Maple Bay, for second chances, for the resilience of the human spirit. Gratitude for the long journey that had brought her here, to this moment, to this peace. Outside, the spring night was peaceful and full of promise. Inside Susan's cottage, all was calm. And in the morning, she would wake up and do it all again. The simple, profound work of living a good life, one day at a time. The quiet hero of Maple Bay slept well that night, untroubled by nightmares or regrets. She had finally learned to forgive herself, And in doing so, she had found something precious: the ability to be fully, completely, authentically herself. That was the greatest heroism of all. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.